What we're looking in this clip is about events leading to the collapse of the Roman Republic, and in particular Cicero's relationship with the Second Triumvirate. Now, if we're going to be looking at these, we've got to really sort of put things back to Caesar's assassination in March 44 BC, because that has a direct impact not only on the collapse of the Republic, but actually leads to Cicero's death as well. Now, in March 44 BC, the 15th of March 44 BC, there's a meeting of the Senate. And at the meeting of the Senate, the two consuls, who are Antony and Caesar, are making their way to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate meeting is being held. Remember, Caesar is also dictator as well. Now, where we've got our two consuls on the way, the plotters, Brutus and Cassius, did not want Antony being in the theatre at the same time as Caesar, because he was quite a powerful man, so he could easily have intervened and got Caesar out of the out of the mess that he was soon to find himself in. In addition to that, though, Brutus also doesn't want Antony killed, because he's also an elected consul, and you can't go around restoring republics and then going around assassinating consuls. So what the conspirators do is they come up with a plan using a guy called Trebonius, and his job is to distract Antony, stop him from entering the theatre, which works perfectly. So Caesar enters the theatre of Pompey on his own without Antony. At an agreed signal, the plotters move in for the kill and stab Caesar. He's stabbed, remember, 23 times. So what happens immediately after Caesar's assassination? Well, following the assassination of Caesar, there's a bit of a lull in proceedings, an ominous silence, and Cicero chairs a meeting between Brutus and Cassius, and also Antony. Now, at this meeting, what is decided is that Antony would pardon the plotters in exchange for all of Caesar's laws, his will to remain in place. The plotters would be given an amnesty, a pardon, and as a sign of reconciliation, Antony and Brutus would conduct Caesar's funeral together. Now, after chairing this meeting, Cicero avoids Rome. He's, remember, not included in the conspiracy. He's seen as unreliable. In some sources, Brutus does call out his name when he's done the deed, but crucially, he leaves Rome at a vital point. If you're Brutus and you've got to give a speech justifying your actions to the Senate, you could really do with a really awesome speechwriter such as Cicero. Brutus doesn't have that. So at Caesar's funeral, it turns out to be a complete debacle for Brutus. Brutus's speech is apparently far too academic. It loses support, whereas Antony, ever the showman, shows the crowd Caesar's bloodied toga. Brutus and Cassius flee Rome. Antony has the support of the army and the plebs. In short, the Republic has not been restored. As for Cicero's view about these events, as ever, he always writes to Atticus. He's quite optimistic initially, but that dies down. He's more than aware that the assassination of Caesar has not led to the revival of free government. He always refers to Brutus and Cassius very favourably, never calling them anything negative like murderers or assassins. Here he calls them heroes who'd gloriously done something. However, the shift in attitude starts soon after sort of Caesar's funeral, where he's passed Brutus's funeral speech by Brutus, and when he's writing to Atticus, he's sending him a copy of it. He says that he would have spoken much more aggressively, and reminds Atticus of the thunderbolts of Demosthenes. And then later on, he actually says, although the courage was that of men, the strategy was that of infants. So what's happened after Caesar's been assassinated is that the conspirators, the plotters, have fled Rome. In particular, Decimus Brutus, he escapes to his province in Cisalpine Gaul, and he's supposed to rally troops, but he doesn't. Brutus and Cassius are really annoyed with Decimus Brutus for not doing this. They've been disgraced. He's sort of kind of got out of it. And in the meantime, Antony has offered them grain supervisor roles, which are a massive insult. Brutus and Cassius, of course, were expecting governorships. Now, Cicero, to his credit, does meet with Brutus and Cassius at Antium, and the meeting that he describes to Atticus is really interesting. He criticises both Brutus and Cassius for not convening the Senate, for not exciting the populace with the speech, for not killing Antony, and likens them to a shipwreck, a ship in fragments. After this, Brutus and Cassius flee east to raise an army. Cicero takes the incredibly brave decision to go back to Rome and take on Antony himself and stop Antony becoming another Caesar. And he does this using his gift of oratory, and in particular, his speech is called the Philippics. And the Philippics are, again, like they're trying to attack Antony and trying to restore the Republic. The aim was to unite the Senate. There's 14 speeches, and they're incredibly passionate, incredibly aggressive. The weird title is because Cicero's sort of oratory hero is a guy called Demosthenes, who had similarly sort of aggressive speeches he made against Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, 3 centuries earlier. The Philippics contain some wonderful little put-downs on Antony. So, for instance, Cicero calls him a drink-sodden, sex-ridden wreck. Beautiful little insults like tried to make your brain work as if you were sober. He calls Antony an utterly loathsome gladiator. That's just literally sort of the smallest sample. There's so many. So where will all these speeches come from? Well, in September 44 BC, Cicero's just arrived back from his meeting with Brutus and Cassius. So he arrives back on the 31st of August. On the 1st of August, there is a meeting of the Senate where Antony wants to swap his his province rather, after his consulship's finished, his province of Macedonia for Gaul, whilst taking Macedonia's legions. Cicero refuses and doesn't turn up to the meeting. Says that he's ill. Antony threatens him by threatening to burn his house down. The 2nd of September, Cicero's there at the Senate. Antony is not, and he delivers his first Philippic, which contains a little bit of praise for Antony in avoiding a civil war and making that deal with Brutus and Cassius, but also an awful lot of criticism. Antony responds by comprehensively making a speech attacking Cicero's career. October, Cicero retires to the country, writes a pamphlet, the 2nd Philippic, and that's circulated to senators. And then everything really does kick off on the 20th of December, where Cicero delivers his 3rd Philippic to the Senate and his 4th Philippic to the people. Now, what this results in is Antony sort of fleeing Rome, and what he does, if he can't take Decimus Brutus's province legally, he'll take it illegally. Remember, though, throughout all of this stuff, Antony is still a consul, so technically Cicero's actions are illegal and tantamount to treason. The new year comes and we have new consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, and they raise 4 legions of fresh recruits. Whilst all this has been going on, almost stealthily, Caesar's adopted son Octavian has got 4 legions himself, 2 of Caesar's veterans and 2 of Antony's Macedonian legions, which have been bribed to move over to Octavian. These actions of Octavian are highly illegal, but Cicero and the Senate legalised them by granting him pro praetorian imperium. Both consuls and Octavian, almost under Cicero's influence, set off to attack Antony at Mutina. Now, around about the same time, we've got a letter written from Cicero to Trebonius, one of the other conspirators, and in it he talks about his use of Octavian. He calls Octavian an excellent boy and says that he prevented Antony from committing every crime and cruelty. So it's really interesting to sort of see Cicero using this type of language to describe Octavian, who we know he actually kind of didn't trust. Now, obviously, Cicero's praising Octavian highly for his work in pushing Antony out of Rome and obviously in attacking him at Mutina. And word comes to Brutus that this has been happening, and he writes a scolding letter to Cicero, really having a go at him, sort of criticising him for cozying up to a would-be tyrant. Check out the last little sentence. Read over your words again and dare deny these are the pleadings of a subject to his king. Now at Mutina, where Decimus Brutus has been sieged by Antony, and we've got Hirtius and Pansa and Octavian relieving him, we've got good news and bad news for Cicero. So this is Mutina. The good news is that Antony's defeated and flees north, and Cicero thinks he can now erase Octavian. He's used him temporarily. He doesn't really trust him. He can get rid of him now. This little kid's not going to cause him any trouble. The bad news is, though, that both Hirtius and Pansa are both killed at that battle. Suetonius and Tacitus, both Roman writers, allege that Octavian was behind both of their murders. I suppose, to use Cicero's phrase, cui bono, sort of indicates that he probably was. Octavian takes over their armies, demands a triumph, and demands the consulship. Cicero could never resist a good little quip, a nice little phrase. And the one that he uses about Octavian, which Octavian learns about, is this raised, praised, and erased quote. And it works out perfectly, really. Well, for Octavian. Cicero and the Senate raised Octavian by granting him that pro-Praetorian imperium, praising him publicly. An example would be the letter to Trebonius. Erase, now that Antony's not a threat, the Senate and Cicero think they can erase Octavian. They do the following things to really snub him. First of all, he's ordered to surrender his legions. He is also further angered by Cicero and the Senate giving a triumph to Decimus Brutus. In addition, Decimus Brutus and Lepidus are given the command to finish off Antony, and then the final insult is that both Brutus and Cassius are given the eastern provinces, so his father's murderers are given the eastern provinces. Octavian is clearly not a happy guy. Now, around about the same time as Octavian decides to march on Rome, Cicero has sent Lepidus and Decimus Brutus to finish off Antony. Lepidus has gone over to Antony's side. Decimus Brutus is murdered. And it's at this point that Cicero writes a letter to one of the governors of Gaul, Plancus. Now, in this letter to Plancus, Cicero is desperate for him to go and attack Antony along with the other governors. And Plancus has previously written to the Senate pledging peace. However, Cicero says that victory, not negotiation, is the only way for us to win. He urges Plancus to identify himself with the Roman Senate and Roman freedom, and tells Plancus to break away from bad Romans who would bring him nothing but utter disgrace. Plancus will completely ignore that letter, and as a bit of a political survivor, he'll go over to Lepidus and Antony as well. So the situation is this: after Mutina, Antony is retreated. Cicero decides to use Lepidus and Decimus Brutus, who he thinks Lepidus is lord to the Republic, to go and finish off Antony. Meanwhile, Octavian marches on Rome. Bad news for Cicero is that Decimus Brutus is soon killed, and Lepidus, of course, goes over to Antony's side. Octavian, who marches on Rome, Suetonius tells us he sends centurions into the Senate, demands that he becomes a consul. Sham elections are made, and Octavian becomes consul at age 20. He then marches north to ally with Antony and Lepidus, and all of a sudden we have our second triumvirate. Brutus and Cassius are in the east. There are no forces in Rome or Italy that are loyal to the Republic, the Senate, or Cicero. Very soon, the second triumvirate, desperately needing cash, launch their own proscriptions, and that will obviously result in Cicero being murdered. So let's have a little look at overall this period from Caesar's death. To a certain extent, Cicero is courageous, but he also makes a lot of mistakes. So, for instance, in terms of courage, he does chair that meeting between Antony, Brutus, and Cassius, but also remember he wasn't included in that plot to kill Caesar either. The fact that he flees Rome after Brutus's, with Brutus's funeral speech, he desperately needed Cicero's help, and then Cicero proceeds to slag off Brutus's funeral speech to Atticus. However, he does meet with the plotters, and then offers them advice, criticises them, but then refers to them as a sort of a ship in fragments. He's influential because they listen to him, they want his advice. The return to Rome to deal with Antony is incredibly courageous and influential. The Philippics. The fact that he uses Hirtius, Panzer, and Octavian against Antony. The fact that he can actually his influence aids Octavian in getting that pro-Praetorian imperium. However, the whole use of Octavian is a giant mistake, particularly his attempts to erase Octavian. The letter to Plancus, again, is a microcosm of this whole issue. To a certain extent, the letter shows Cicero's courage and shows his influence, that he's trying to get such an important Roman to attack Lepidus and Antony, maybe even thinks he can, but then, crucially, Plancus completely ignores his advice. In summary, what's Cicero's biggest mistake at this point? The big threat, the big mistake, I suppose, is underestimating Octavian.